Vivian Sterling once believed the man kneeling over the broken copier in the boardroom was nothing more than a shadow in a cheap suit. His sleeves were stained with ink, his shoulders bent from years of being overlooked, his eyes carrying the quiet patience of someone who had long since stopped expecting the world to notice him. But when she picked up the worn notebook he left behind, the smirk on her lips disappeared in an instant. The first page repeated, word for word, the sentence she had spoken only minutes earlier. The next page named the executive who was about to betray her. And the final page held a single line that made her blood run cold. When Vivian reached this point, she would finally understand who her father had destroyed. Stay with this story until the very end. Press subscribe now, because the collapse of the Sterling Empire is only getting started. The headquarters of Sterling Whitmore Group rose above Midtown Manhattan like a monument to certainty, 40 stories of glass reflecting a skyline that answered to almost no one. On the 80th floor, Vivian Sterling stood at the head of a boardroom table preparing to finalize a merger worth $9.6 billion with a defense technology firm that had spent 3 years courting her signature. She wore her composure like armor, each word measured, each gesture designed to remind the room who controlled the outcome. The deal was supposed to be simple. It was supposed to be the crowning achievement of her first full year as chief executive. The moment that would finally silence the whispers that she had only inherited her seat rather than earned it. The meeting fractured the instant the secure printing system failed. Confidential documents jammed mid-transmission, triggering an automatic lockdown that froze half the terminals in the room. A technician was summoned from the building's maintenance contractor, a quiet man named Evan Halloway, who arrived carrying a scarred tool bag and an expression that gave nothing away. He wore simple clothes, nothing pressed, nothing tailored, and the moment he stepped through the door, the executives around the table treated him the way people treat furniture they intend to walk past. A vice president named Blaine Carrington made no effort to hide his contempt. He told Evan to keep his distance from the table, remarking with a thin smile that the smell of the basement did not belong on the 80th floor. Several people laughed. Vivian said nothing to stop it. She only glanced at Evan long enough to demand that he fix the equipment quickly and disappear, her tone carrying the practiced indifference of someone who had learned early that attention was a currency she did not spend on people beneath her. Evan worked in silence, his hands steady, his face unreadable, but his eyes moved constantly around the room, cataloging details no one else seemed to notice. A new camera had been installed in the corner overnight, angled differently than the one it replaced. The projector had been tampered with, its firmware altered just enough to intercept outgoing files. A folder near Blaine's elbow had been swapped for another that looked nearly identical, and on the screen behind Vivian, her digital signature was being duplicated in the background of a document she had never approved. He said nothing about any of it. He simply repaired the printer, packed his tools, and turned toward the door. Before he left, he looked at Vivian for a moment that lasted slightly too long, the kind of look a person gives someone they already know is walking into danger. Then he was gone, and beneath the chair where he had been kneeling, a worn leather notebook remained, forgotten or perhaps left on purpose, waiting for someone curious enough to open it. Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, the city carried on with its usual indifference. Taxis weaving through crowded avenues, delivery trucks idling at curbs, the entire machinery of Manhattan moving without any awareness of the quiet unraveling beginning 80 floors above. Inside, the executives resumed their conversation as though nothing unusual had occurred, already forgetting the presence of the man who had briefly interrupted their afternoon. Blaine straightened his cufflinks and resumed his pitch about the defense technology acquisition, his voice regaining its polished confidence now that the inconvenience had been swept aside. Vivian allowed herself a private moment of satisfaction, believing the meeting had proceeded exactly as she intended. She had learned early in her career that control meant never allowing anyone, regardless of their role, to disrupt the rhythm of a room she was meant to command. What she could not have known, standing at the head of that table with her signature poised over documents she had not yet fully read, was that the rhythm of her entire life was about to be interrupted by the very man she had just dismissed, without a second thought. After the meeting dissolved into scattered conversations and the click of closing laptops, Vivian noticed the notebook and almost handed it to her assistant to discard without a second thought. But something about the handwriting caught her eye, a tight, careful script that looked strangely familiar. She opened it, expecting nothing, and found a line that stopped her cold. At 10:42 in the morning, Vivian would say that she did not pay for delay. It was the exact sentence she had spoken to Evan only an hour before, word for word, punctuation and all. She told herself it was coincidence, the kind of vague prediction anyone could stumble into by accident. But she turned the page anyway, and the next entry described Blaine offering her a supplemental agreement bound in a pale blue folder, with an instruction beneath it in plain block letters: "Do not sign it." Minutes later, as if summoned by the page itself, Blaine walked back into the room holding exactly that folder, its cover the same shade of blue described in the notebook. Vivian's spine went rigid, though she kept her expression carved into its usual mask of authority. She asked Blaine why the addendum required immediate signature, and he answered smoothly, citing volatility in the market and the risk of losing the deal within hours. His words were confident, but his eyes drifted somewhere past her shoulder, avoiding contact in a way she had never noticed from him before. She set the folder aside, telling him she needed time to review it properly, and watched a flicker of irritation cross his face before he composed himself again. Alone in her office later that evening, she opened the notebook fully and found page after page describing details about her own life that no stranger should have known. Her habit of drinking her coffee black without sugar. The backup access code to the private boardroom that only 3 people in the company were supposed to know. The name of her personal attorney. Even the anniversary of her mother's death, a date she had never spoken aloud to anyone at the company. Her fear curdled into anger, and she decided the man from maintenance was either a stalker or a spy planted by a rival firm. She called security and ordered them to locate Evan Halloway immediately, certain that whatever explanation existed would be simple enough to end with his termination and perhaps a lawsuit. But when she turned to the next page of the notebook, the words waiting there made the back of her neck go cold. It said that she would call security, that they would not find him, and that the person she truly needed to find was standing closer to her than she realized. Security searched the building for nearly 2 hours and came back with nothing useful. Evan Halloway's personnel file described him only as a contracted technician, low salary, minimal clearance, a man who existed on paper as little more than a name attached to a maintenance company. Every camera that should have captured his movement through the building that day had somehow failed or been wiped clean, all except a single frozen frame from a corridor on the 79th floor, showing him standing perfectly still, staring directly into the lens as though he had known exactly where it was hidden. The head of building security, a broad-shouldered man named Douglas Ferris, brought the frozen frame to Vivian personally, admitting with visible discomfort that he had never seen a system fail so selectively in his 15 years managing the tower's surveillance. Every other camera on every other floor had recorded normally, capturing employees moving through hallways, elevators rising and falling, deliveries arriving at the loading dock without interruption. Only the footage tracing Evan's path had vanished, as though something or someone had reached into the system with surgical precision and removed exactly what needed to disappear. Vivian asked whether such a targeted erasure was even technically possible without insider access to the network's deepest architecture. Ferris admitted, reluctantly, that it would require knowledge of systems that predated his own tenure at the company, knowledge held by only a handful of engineers who had helped build the original infrastructure long before he was ever hired. The implication settled over the room slowly, and Vivian felt, for the first time, a genuine chill at the thought that the man from maintenance might understand her company's foundations more intimately than she did herself. Blaine pressed harder for Vivian to finalize the merger addendum before the trading day closed, warning that even a short delay could cost the company hundreds of millions in lost value. He spoke with the practiced urgency of a man who had rehearsed the argument before ever walking into the room, and for a moment Vivian nearly reached for her pen out of habit. But the memory of the notebook's warning held her hand steady, and instead of signing immediately, she quietly instructed her legal team to review the addendum line by line before anything left the building. The review uncovered a clause buried deep within the technical appendix, written in language dense enough to discourage casual reading, transferring operational control of a subsidiary that held every one of Sterling Whitmore's core security patents. If she had signed as instructed, she would have surrendered the foundation of the company's technological power without any public announcement, without any immediate consequence visible to shareholders, and without anyone outside a small circle even realizing what had happened until it was far too late to undo. For the first time since childhood, Vivian felt something close to real fear settle into her chest, because the man she had dismissed as beneath her attention had somehow known this moment was coming before it arrived. She left her office and made her way down to the maintenance level, a part of the building she had never once visited despite having worked above it for years. There she found Evan sitting alone at a metal table, eating a simple lunch from a worn plastic container, entirely unbothered by the search that had consumed half the building's security staff. She kept her voice sharp, still clinging to the tone of someone accustomed to command, and demanded that he explain himself immediately. Evan looked up at her without hurry, set down his fork, and answered in a voice that carried no anger, only a kind of tired clarity that unsettled her more than shouting ever could. He told her that she did not need to believe him, but that if she continued treating the people on the lower floors as invisible, she would never notice who was cutting the cables beneath her own elevator. The words landed with a weight that silenced whatever accusation she had prepared, and for the first time, she found herself with nothing left to say. Over the following days, pieces of Evan's history surfaced that contradicted everything his personnel file claimed. Nearly a decade earlier, under a small contracting firm long since dissolved, he had designed the very first layer of digital security that protected Sterling Whitmore's most sensitive systems. He had not stumbled into the company by chance. He had built part of its foundation before quietly disappearing from its records, a fact that no current employee seemed to remember, or perhaps had simply never been told. His wife, a woman named Maris Holloway, had once worked inside the company as an internal data auditor, trusted with access to financial systems few people outside the executive suite were ever permitted to see. During a routine review years earlier, she uncovered evidence that a faction within the leadership had been laundering funds through shell accounts, manipulating vendor contracts, and selling private client information to competing firms. Before she could formally report what she had found, she died in a car accident that investigators quietly attributed to sudden brake failure, a conclusion that closed the case within days and left almost no record behind. Evan never accepted that explanation. He had spent years afterward gathering fragments of proof on his own, quietly, without lawyers, without headlines, moving through low-level jobs that gave him just enough access to watch the company from angles no executive ever imagined being observed. The notebook Vivienne now carried was not something he had written. It was Maris's own final record, a document she had compiled in the last months of her life, mapping out exactly how the people around her would behave once their secrets were threatened, because she had studied their habits closely enough to predict their choices with unsettling accuracy. Vivienne's certainty began to crack under the weight of what she was learning, though her pride refused to let her admit she needed help from a man she had humiliated in front of an entire boardroom. She asked him, almost accusingly, why he had never simply exposed everything publicly if he had proof of wrongdoing all along. Evan answered that truth rarely wins the moment it appears, because people with enough power can bury it, discredit it, or drown it in noise, and that truth only wins once the person telling lies has nowhere left to run. Something in Vivienne shifted after that conversation, though she would not have called it trust, not yet. It was closer to the uncomfortable recognition that the people she had always assumed were loyal to her might not deserve that loyalty at all. She began watching Blaine differently, noticing small inconsistencies in his explanations, hesitations in his voice that she had never registered before because she had never needed to look closely at someone she considered beneath suspicion. She started arriving earlier than usual, staying later than her staff expected, quietly reviewing contracts she had once signed on the assumption that her legal team had already vetted every clause. What she found troubled her more with each passing day. Small discrepancies in vendor agreements, inflated invoices, routed through companies with no verifiable address, approval signatures dated for meetings that, according to her own calendar, had never actually taken place. None of it was significant enough alone to raise alarm, but together it painted a portrait of an organization far less transparent than the one she believed she had inherited. Evan, for his part, offered no further explanations unless she asked directly, seeming content to let her draw her own conclusions at her own pace rather than pushing her toward suspicion. He understood something she was only beginning to grasp, that people rarely accept uncomfortable truths handed to them freely, but they often accept the same truths once they believe they discovered them on their own. It was a patience Maris herself must have possessed, the kind built from years spent watching powerful people underestimate anyone who did not raise their voice. Believing she had finally regained control of the situation, Vivienne called an emergency session with the full board, intending to confront Blaine directly with the evidence her legal team had uncovered about the hidden clause. She walked into that meeting with the same confidence that had defined her entire career, certain that laying out the facts would be enough to expose him in front of everyone who mattered. Evan warned her beforehand that the meeting was exactly the trap her opponents wanted her to walk into. But years of instinct told her she was the smartest person in every room she entered, and she dismissed his caution as unnecessary. The night before the session, Evan tried once more to slow her down, laying out the pattern he had observed across years of watching men like Blaine operate. He explained that people who build fraud carefully never leave themselves exposed to a single accusation without first preparing a counterattack, and that confronting someone so prepared without first understanding the full shape of the trap was a mistake even seasoned executives made when their pride outpaced their patience. Vivienne listened, or appeared to, nodding at the right moments, but the version of her that had spent a lifetime winning every negotiation could not fully accept that this particular fight required a different kind of strategy. She told him, with more gentleness than she usually allowed herself, that she appreciated his caution, but that she had built her entire identity around being the person who solved problems directly, rather than waiting in shadows the way he had learned to survive. It was not an insult, though it carried an edge of the old arrogance still clinging to her, and Evan recognized the tone immediately because Maris had once spoken to him with a similar mixture of gratitude and stubbornness before walking into her own final confrontation years earlier. He said nothing further that night, understanding that some lessons could only be learned through consequence rather than warning. She presented her findings with precision, describing the hidden transfer clause and Blaine's insistence on rushing her signature, watching the faces around the table for the flicker of guilt she expected to see. Instead, the board's legal counsel produced a competing file, thick with documentation showing Vivienne's own digital signature attached to a series of questionable transactions stretching back nearly 3 years. Every piece of evidence in the room suddenly pointed back toward her, not toward Blaine, and the shift happened so quickly that she barely had time to process what was unfolding. Blaine allowed himself a small, controlled smile, suggesting gently that for the sake of the company's reputation, it might be best for Vivienne to step aside from her position while an independent investigation took place. One by one, the members of the board who had spent months deferring to her judgment now avoided her eyes entirely, their loyalty evaporating the instant her authority appeared vulnerable. The hunter had somehow become the target without ever noticing the trap closing around her. She tried to argue, her voice sharpening into the tone she had always used to end disagreements before they began, but she found that the tone which once silenced rooms now produced only polite, indifferent nods. Legal counsel spoke over her twice, each time redirecting attention back to the transactions bearing her signature, each time reinforcing the narrative that had been constructed long before she ever walked through the door. She realized, with a sinking clarity, that this meeting had never been convened to hear her evidence at all. It had been convened to bury her beneath evidence of her own, evidence she had never created but could not immediately disprove. Across the table, an older board member named Harold Pemberton watched the proceedings with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, though he said nothing to intervene. Vivienne had always considered him a quiet ally, a man who owed his position partly to her father's patronage, yet even he chose silence over risk when the room turned against her. It was a small detail, easy to miss amid the larger collapse, but it taught her something she would carry forward. Loyalty built on convenience dissolves the instant convenience changes direction. In the chaos of that moment, Vivienne glanced down and noticed a torn page at the back of the notebook, its edge ragged where something had clearly been removed. A single line remained legible along the torn margin, instructing her that when they forced her resignation, she should not resist, and that she should allow them to believe they had already won. She realized, with a strange mixture of relief and unease, that Evan had known this exact moment was coming long before she ever walked into that room. Rather than fighting the accusations, Vivienne signed the temporary resignation papers without protest, watching visible relief spread across the faces of board members who had expected a far longer battle. Blaine stepped into the role of acting chief executive almost immediately, his satisfaction barely concealed as he thanked the board for their swift and decisive action. Throughout the entire scene, Evan remained near the back of the room, silent, observing everything with the patience of a man who had not yet placed his final piece on the board. Once Vivienne lost her position, the retaliation against Evan began almost instantly, revealing how much influence Blaine actually held behind the scenes. His maintenance contract was terminated within hours, his building access was revoked, and threats of legal action for unauthorized data access began circulating through internal channels clearly designed to intimidate him into silence. For the first time in her adult life, Vivienne found herself stripped of drivers, assistants, and private offices, forced to navigate the world without the invisible scaffolding of privilege she had never once had to think about. She discovered quickly how differently the city treated her without a title attached to her name. Dorman, who once greeted her by name at restaurants, now asked for reservations she had never needed before. Calls to attorneys who had spent years billing her family for their loyalty went unanswered for days, their assistants offering vague excuses about scheduling conflicts that clearly meant something else entirely. It was a small taste of the invisibility Evan had lived inside for years, and it humbled her in ways no boardroom lecture ever could have managed. Meanwhile, Blaine moved quickly to consolidate his temporary authority, replacing key department heads with allies who owed him their positions, and therefore their silence. He granted interviews to financial publications, framing Vivienne's departure as a necessary correction after years of what he called reckless leadership, inherited through nepotism rather than merit. Each article twisted the timeline just enough to make her look reckless and him look responsible, a narrative built with the same careful precision he had once used to construct the very fraud now hidden beneath her name. She eventually made her way to Evan's modest apartment in Queens, a small, quiet space that felt worlds away from the marble corridors she had spent her career inhabiting. A pair of small shoes sat neatly by the front door, and a child's crayon drawing of a family hung slightly crooked on the refrigerator, though the child himself was staying with his grandmother that week, kept carefully apart from the danger now circling his father's life. The apartment told a story Vivienne had never bothered to imagine, one of unpaid medical bills from his wife's final months, legal complaints that had been dismissed without explanation, and letters of appeal that had never received a single reply. The building itself was modest, its hallway lit by a single flickering bulb, its walls thin enough to carry the murmur of a neighbor's television through the plaster. Vivienne stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, acutely aware that every instinct she had spent her life honing was useless here. There was no assistant to announce her arrival, no marble floor to steady her footing, no title that meant anything within these four walls. For the first time since childhood, she understood what it felt like to walk into a room where her name carried no weight at all. Evan made coffee without asking whether she wanted any, setting a chipped mug in front of her with the same quiet efficiency he brought to every task she had watched him perform. She studied the apartment while he worked, noticing a folded flag displayed modestly on a shelf, a photograph of a woman with a warm, unguarded smile standing beside a much younger Evan, and a small collection of mechanical tools arranged with the precision of a man who valued order because so much of his life had been taken from him without warning. Nothing about the space suggested defeat. It suggested endurance, the kind built slowly over years by someone who had learned to survive without asking permission from anyone above him. She asked him, quietly and without her usual sharpness, why he continued helping her at all when her own family might be connected to his wife's death. Evan considered the question for a long moment before answering that he was not helping her because she deserved it, but because Maris had always believed that a person born into darkness could still choose to turn on a light. The simplicity of his answer struck Vivienne harder than any accusation could have, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt something close to genuine shame settle over her. It was during this quiet stretch of exile that Vivienne discovered the notebook was missing its final page, the one section that seemed to matter most of all. Evan admitted that Maris had hidden that page somewhere only a member of the Sterling family could access, deep within the private archive once maintained by Vivienne's late father, Conrad Sterling. Vivienne resisted the idea instinctively, because in her mind, Conrad had always represented the very image of unshakable integrity, the man who built the empire and taught her that weakness was never an option. Using her legitimate inheritance rights, she and Evan gained access to the archive, a climate-controlled vault few people even knew existed beneath one of the company's older properties. The air inside smelled of aging paper and dust, and rows of identical steel boxes stretched down a corridor lit only by motion-activated fixtures that flickered on one section at a time as they walked deeper into the vault. Vivienne had visited the building above this room countless times without ever knowing what lay beneath it, another small reminder of how much of her own inheritance had been kept carefully out of view. Among old ledgers and forgotten contracts, they found a box containing aging audio recordings, an incomplete accident report from the day Maris died, and finally, tucked inside a sealed folder, the missing page of the notebook. It did not contain another prediction. It contained the transcript of a conversation. According to the recording, Maris had once met privately with Conrad Sterling, pleading with him to expose the truth before it destroyed the company from within. Her voice on the recording was calm and measured, the voice of someone who still believed, at that point, that reason might be enough to change his mind. She reminded him of the clients who trusted the firm with their savings, of the employees who had no idea their own retirement funds were being quietly diverted through accounts designed to disappear the moment anyone looked too closely. Conrad refused, explaining that a scandal of that scale would collapse the largest deal of his career, and that some risks required what he coldly referred to as personal risk management, a phrase vague enough to sound bureaucratic and precise enough to explain everything that followed. His tone on the recording carried no hesitation, no doubt, only the practiced calm of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions and sleeping soundly afterward. He had not pulled a trigger or cut a brake line himself, but his signature approved the process that ensured Maris's warnings would never reach anyone who mattered. Vivienne sat frozen, the image of her father crumbling apart in her mind piece by piece. Every childhood memory she had cherished, every lesson he had taught her about strength and legacy, suddenly wore a different face, one she did not recognize and did not want to claim as her own inheritance. She thought of the portrait that hung in the lobby of the tower, the one every employee passed each morning without a second glance, the one that depicted Conrad Sterling as a visionary rather than a man who had traded a woman's life for the convenience of silence. Evan watched her absorb the revelation without offering comfort he knew she would not accept from him. He had lived with this truth for years, carrying it quietly through nights spent piecing together fragments that others had tried so carefully to erase, and he understood better than anyone that grief for a stranger's crimes could not be softened by kind words alone. Instead, he simply let the silence stretch between them, giving her the space to sit with what she now knew rather than rushing her toward forgiveness or resolve. On the back of that final page, in handwriting far gentler than anything else in the notebook, Maris had left one last message meant specifically for her. It told Vivienne that she was not responsible for her father's sins, but that she would become him the moment she chose silence over truth, a warning written years before Vivienne herself had ever needed to hear it. Reading those words felt less like receiving a message from a stranger and more like being seen clearly for the first time in her adult life by a woman who had never even had the chance to meet her. Blaine, confident that every piece of evidence against him had been erased or buried, organized a shareholder meeting to formally remove Vivienne from any future role and finalize the very merger she had once tried to block. He believed the matter was already settled, the outcome already secured, the company's future already written in his favor. What he did not anticipate was Vivienne walking into that room not as the untouchable heiress she had once been, but as someone who had finally learned the cost of looking away. She entered without an entourage, without the practiced spectacle that had once defined her public appearances, walking instead beside the man the entire boardroom had mocked months earlier as nothing more than a lucky repairman. Laughter rippled through the room as Blaine referred to Evan with the same casual contempt he had used since the beginning, clearly expecting the moment to end in humiliation. Evan said nothing in response. He simply placed the worn notebook on the table in front of everyone, letting its presence speak before he did. Blaine laughed harder, insisting that an old notebook held no legal weight whatsoever and could not possibly threaten anything real. Vivian answered calmly, her voice steady in a way it had never been before this entire ordeal began, telling him that she had not brought it as evidence at all, but simply to see who in the room would flinch at the sight of it. Almost immediately afterward, the large screen behind them flickered to life, though not with the kind of dramatic exposé anyone expected. Instead, it displayed a quiet stream of data, records showing that every illicit transaction the board had ever attempted to hide had been automatically archived within a security framework Evan himself had designed nearly a decade earlier. The company had never been hacked. It had simply been recording its own guilt the entire time, faithfully and without anyone realizing the system was still watching. Blaine attempted to redirect blame back toward Vivian, insisting the falsified signatures had originated from her personal devices. Evan calmly introduced another layer of evidence, showing that the fraudulent signatures had actually been generated using equipment registered to Blaine's own office, a detail no amount of confident denial could erase from the room's collective memory. Panic spread through the assembled shareholders as they realized how thoroughly they had been misled, and many who had defended Blaine only minutes earlier now visibly distanced themselves from him. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as investors who had spent years assuming the company's foundations were unshakable now watched those foundations dissolve in real time. Reporters near the back of the room began typing furiously, sensing that the story unfolding before them would dominate headlines long after the meeting adjourned. Vivian stood perfectly still through all of it, resisting the urge to feel any satisfaction because she understood that every fresh humiliation for Blaine also exposed another layer of her own family's failure. The most decisive revelation came when the company's outside counsel announced that, shortly before her death, Maris Holloway had legally transferred ownership of the original security architecture into a private trust. The current sole administrator of that trust was revealed to be Evan Holloway himself, meaning every critical system the company depended upon required his ongoing approval to remain legally operational. The man once dismissed as unworthy of standing near the boardroom table now held, quite literally, the key to the entire tower's continued function. A stunned silence settled over the room as the weight of that fact registered, shareholders glancing at one another as though searching for someone who might explain how such an arrangement had gone unnoticed for so long. Blaine's confident posture finally cracked, his shoulders sinking as he realized that no amount of persuasion could undo a legal structure built years before he had ever risen to power. He looked toward the exits, calculating, but security had already begun moving quietly toward his side of the room, anticipating exactly this reaction. Standing before the shocked assembly, Vivian acknowledged her family's role in years of concealment, offering a direct apology to Evan for the death that had never been properly investigated, and admitting her own complicity in a culture that taught employees to dismiss anyone who appeared powerless. Her voice did not waver the way it had during earlier crises in her career, not because the moment was easier, but because for the first time she was speaking from something honest rather than something rehearsed for effect. Several shareholders who had spent the meeting whispering among themselves fell completely silent, watching a version of Vivian Sterling none of them had ever seen before. This was not a moment of easy redemption bought with a single speech. She agreed to step away from daily leadership during a full independent investigation, terminate the corrupted merger entirely, establish a compensation fund for those harmed by years of concealment, and hand over every relevant document to federal regulators without exception. Her legal team would later describe the concessions as unprecedented for a sitting chief executive, the kind of surrender no consultant would ever recommend. Yet the very act of surrendering so completely was what finally began restoring some measure of trust among employees who had spent years assuming leadership answered to no one. Security removed Blaine from the building before the meeting even concluded, charges of financial fraud and identity forgery already being prepared against him. Several board members connected to the scheme were suspended within days, their reputations unraveling as swiftly as the empire they had tried to protect. Turning toward Evan, Vivian braced herself for him to seize the enormous leverage now sitting in his hands, assuming any reasonable person in his position would claim the company as retribution. Instead, Evan declined the position of power being offered to him without hesitation. He told her plainly that he had no interest in owning her tower, that all he had ever wanted was for his wife's name to stop being buried beneath its foundation. The simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any courtroom victory could have, closing the emotional core of the story with quiet dignity rather than triumphant spectacle. Months later, Sterling Whitmore Group renamed one of its independent oversight divisions the Maris Holloway Integrity Office, a permanent acknowledgement of the truth the company had once tried to erase. Evan never became the kind of billionaire who sought headlines or public recognition. He simply reclaimed the shares, the dignity, and the rightful control of technology that had always belonged to him, choosing a quiet life over a spotlight he never wanted in the first place. Blaine's arrest sent ripples through financial circles far beyond the walls of Sterling Whitmore itself, prompting several partner firms to quietly re-examine their own internal audits out of fear that similar schemes might be hiding within their own ledgers. Regulators who had spent years treating the company with a kind of deferential distance suddenly found themselves with more evidence than they knew how to process quickly, evidence that implicated not just individuals but entire patterns of behavior tolerated for far too long across the industry. For Vivian, watching the story spread beyond her own company was both vindicating and humbling, a reminder that the corruption she had only just discovered had never been confined to a single office or a single family. Vivian no longer occupied the cold, untouchable throne she once held on the 80th floor. She returned as interim chair under the direct supervision of a newly reformed board, not because she had been fully forgiven, but because she had chosen, finally, to dismantle the lie that had shaped her entire life. The employees who once avoided her eyes in elevators now greeted her with a kind of cautious respect she had never earned before, not through fear, but through the visible proof that she had chosen accountability over comfort when it would have been far easier to simply let the truth stay buried alongside her father's reputation. The company itself changed in smaller, quieter ways that never made headlines. Maintenance staff were included in safety briefings once reserved only for senior management. Contractors who had spent years working in the building's lower levels without recognition were given proper credentials and formal acknowledgement for the systems they maintained every single day without complaint. It was not a revolution, only a correction, but Vivian understood now that corrections mattered just as much as grand gestures, sometimes more, because they were the details nobody would ever notice unless something first went terribly wrong. In the final quiet scene, Evan received the notebook back from her, its final page now completely blank. She asked him what he intended to write there next. Looking out at the skyline that had once intimidated him and now meant nothing at all, Evan answered simply that he no longer wished to write anyone's future, and that this time, the living deserved the right to choose their own path forward. As he turned to leave, Vivian glanced down at the taffel and found a single sentence written in his familiar, careful handwriting across that once empty page. She had not become her father after all.
Preserve the gourd. Trust me. I'm going to try and preserve it. Yeah, my controller just died right there, bro. How weird is that? Oh no, I'm not gonna swap it out though. I'm gonna keep it. Just so I could use an excuse. Stick drift, bro. I got stick drift. That's what it is. I only have stick drift when I lose. What's up? What's up, Rosemont? How you doing? I don't know why. Oh my god, bro. What the fuck even is that? She took away my entire health bar already. Don't even make sense, bro. Shit don't even make sense. There we go. That's what I'm fucking talking about, bro.